Welcome to True Talk on WMNF 88.5 with Ahmed and Samar. On today's program, we're going to be speaking to a writer and speaker and author named John Hoffman about the supposed rift between Trump and Netanyahu, and also growing international pressure, especially from European governments and allies of Israel, on the Netanyahu government in Israel to stop the blockade on Gaza and to stop starving the children there or people there, and to end this war. So there's growing pressure that's happening. And if we have time, we'll also get to your phone calls. That and more. We'll be right back. This is True Talk on WMNF.
To take a studio, it's best.
At
Spectrum, we know life moves fast.
Will Russell Fogg, I guess, keep your head held high? Summer? Do you relate to this? Sam, do you relate to this message, keeping your head high?
Always, alhamdulillah. خلي راسك فوق or علي راسك فوق. Yeah, keep your head.
Raise your head high, or and keep it up.
Yeah,
it's a nice song.
Sometimes it's difficult to translate, Ahmed, from Arabic to English.
Yeah, it can be difficult because one word has so much meaning, and this is a Tunisian dialect. Hear it. It seems kind of inspiring, but at a time where you see so much death and destruction in Gaza and in Palestine, you have to look for inspiration and for hope. And I was watching this interview with Dr. Barghouti, who's one of the most recognized faces representing Palestine. He is an independent figure and respected by the different political parties there and people. And he was saying that he feels like, Palestine is on the brink of winning, that, they're on the brink of self-determination, that despite all this death and destruction, there hasn't, ever been this type of growing pressure on Israel, where they're getting condemned by even their closest allies. Only the United States and pretty much is still standing with Israel at this point, maybe Germany and some other, fringe countries. I'm not saying Germany's a fringe, but, Germany is one of the bigger states that's still maybe standing with them, but they're all criticizing what Israel is doing in Gaza right now by starving people, and they're saying this has gone too far.
True, Ahmed, and some of the international media, and actually also some of our mainstream media like NBC in the US just published a report on the impending death of at least 14,000 babies because of malnutrition. I mean, I just posted a photo on Twitter with a child who is double or triple amputee. I mean, she's not even 4, and then emaciated. People are dying. And I know somebody from a doctor that I try from time to time to check on in Gaza, in one of the hospitals. And he himself is a skeleton, Ahmed. They hardly have food. And Eid is coming soon, and in this particular feast of Muslims that we celebrate after the end of the Hajj, that we are supposed to slaughter lamb and give part of it to the poor. There are maybe a few sheep or lamb or cows remain in Gaza to feed more than 2 million people. And there is, I know that Netanyahu said he's going to open the border and allow trucks in. Gaza needs 500 trucks a day of food, 500 trucks of food to survive, not to die. And I think by last time I checked, Ahmed, they allowed 87 or 78, I'm not sure. And some of it was akfan, shrouds to bury the dead. There are so many dead people that really they ran out of cloth to bury them.
Wow.
So they were sending trucks and trucks of shrouds and very, very few medicine. Like, I mean, think of Ahmed, people who have diabetes, and they are type 1 diabetes type, or they have blood pressure. I mean, you have to have a medication for blood pressure. I know people who have cancer, but they're just, waiting to die. People who want dialysis. I mean, we're talking about things that has nothing to do with dying from a bomb, but these statistics are not even being calculated at the moment. It's overwhelming. And a lot of people are seeing that. They're seeing it. And this is why we see demonstrations all over the world, especially in Europe, that you were just talking about. For instance, in the US, I think people are planning this weekend, and there was demonstrations last weekend. So the rest of the world is seeing what's going on.
Yeah, and the rest of the world is seeing. People are sick of what's happening, and some people are commenting saying what Israel is doing is actually the biggest threat that's driving anti-Semitism, because they're constantly trying to act as if they are the face and the representatives of Judaism and Jewish people worldwide, when we know that that's not true. That Zionism is the only political route and path for the Jewish people worldwide. That is not true. However, they keep justifying their actions and taking the land, saying this was promised, religiously or biblically, historically, to the people of to the Jewish people, and they're not acting in the best interests of Jewish people. In fact, all this death and destruction, people are worried is going to somehow is creating a blowback, is creating a backlash, and that should be concerning to everyone. But somebody has to stop it, and everybody keeps saying that it's in the hands of the United States. So at this point, it's really, the people. I mean, okay, Biden was there, and did not, and we later learned that actually Biden never told all these conversations and promises that Biden and his administration are doing everything that they can to stop the violence, to get a ceasefire. It turned out to be all false. He never asked Netanyahu to stop. Never. And it seems like even Trump, as bad as Trump is on many issues, he's actually more hands-on, trying to, stop what's happening or somehow steer it in a different direction, putting pressure on to get aid in. And Israel keeps saying, Netanyahu's government keeps saying that they're doing so, or they're about to. But the New York Times just reported yesterday, despite all these promises, people are not seeing the aid. The food is not getting in, and people are starving. Some are estimating up to 14,000 children are going to die, are on the brink of death if they don't get aid in. That is just so disturbing. So that's some of the things that we're going to be speaking to John Hoffman about. He wrote an article about this supposed rift between Trump and Netanyahu. It appears that it's been weeks since they've talked, and several different cabinet ministers, cabinet secretaries from Trump's cabinet were scheduled to go to Israel. One of them, I think the Secretary of Defense at some point was supposed to go to Israel, Pete Hegseth, and he changed course and did not go during Trump's visit to the Middle East. And more recently, J.D. Vance was supposed to go to Israel, but he also did not end up going. So Samar, our guest, has joined if you want to introduce him.
Good morning or good afternoon, Dr. John Hoffman. We've had him, I guess, one time before, and it was a very popular, most watched and listened to interview, by the way, John. The last time I had you on the show, but John Hoffman has a PhD, of course, and is a research fellow at Cato Foreign Policy, and he writes and concentrates on the Middle East, the Gulf region also. But he just wrote and published this article, "The Trump-Netanyahu Rift Hinges on Gaza and Iran. For the administration to achieve its goals in the Middle East, more daylight between the U.S. and Israel is necessary." And I'm very pleased to say that he is on the phone with us. So, Dr. Hoffman, there was so much talk about the rift between what my co-host was alluding to, some sort of a rift that was between Biden and Netanyahu. And now we know that there was nothing really. He never told Netanyahu to stop this war. He was arming the Israeli government. And now you write about the Trump-Netanyahu rift. Is there actually a true rift between them, or this is just talk and for our consumption, especially before Trump's visit to the Middle East?
Well, first, thank you for having me on, and that's awesome to hear that was one of the most watched episodes. That is an honor. But on the rift itself, I think you're spot on. We can only judge a rift based on actual policy change, because we saw with Biden, if we had $1 for every report, we saw that he's so frustrated with Netanyahu. You know, there were so many reports, and it just never led to policy change. So, you know, talk is cheap. You really want to see policy move in a different direction. And with Trump, we're seeing these reports again. We're hearing reports of him being angered and frustrated. He didn't go to Israel during his trip, as Ahmed referred or just noted. There's been other, reports about increasing frustration between the two. Probably the most notable was a report written in Israel Hayom, which is owned by Miriam Adelson. She's a very pro-Israel hawkish mega donor to Trump's campaign. And that article likely would not have been published without her explicit consent. So on the rhetorical level, we're seeing it. But with Trump, we're actually starting to see it a little bit with policy. We're seeing it mainly in Syria, in Yemen, whereby he stopped bombing the Houthis in Yemen. In Syria, he's lifting sanctions, although it's being slow-rolled, but he's lifting sanctions. He's starting to withdraw U.S. troops. All of this, the stop bombing of the Houthis and his actions in Syria, are in direct contradiction to what Netanyahu has requested. And we're also seeing him pursuing negotiations with Tehran, but that has yet to yield fruit. So we're seeing policy change, and it's significant, it's noteworthy. But what I try to argue in the article is, where it really matters, where it will really come down to is he able to distance himself from Netanyahu on Gaza and on Iran?
I know it's almost impossible to understand what goes on in the mind of Trump, because he keeps changing his mind. Like, is there any possibility of you knowing what does he really think of Gaza and what is going on in Gaza? Because, for instance, on the plane, I think going to the Middle East, he was saying, or coming back, I can't remember, the situation is bad. We have to allow food in. He seems to be very sympathetic to the people and what's happening to them. But like, and then you know that he wanted to buy Gaza and then get rid of the Palestinians and then turn it into an oasis and then turn it into a mega Palm Beach kind of area. Like, what on earth does he think of Gaza and what should be done with Gaza?
So I think there's a few things happening here. First, whether you agree with Trump's domestic and international agenda or not, it's a very ambitious agenda. So if we think back to Joe Biden, the war in Gaza really became an albatross around his neck. It consumed a lot of his time and resources. And I think Trump doesn't want to see that repeated with his administration. When it comes to Gaza, first, on the humanitarian front, the just apocalypse, like in pictures that we're seeing and videos that we're seeing coming out of Gaza, I think there is probably some element of him that is human and sees what's happening, and it makes him upset. And this is U.S. weapons are facilitating this, so I hope that would push him towards wanting to really end this conflict, but to really end it and to break with Netanyahu, it requires him to abandon this fanciful idea that you just mentioned of, let's just call it what it is, essentially calling to ethnically cleanse Gaza, turn it into some Riviera of the Middle East. This idea of a U.S.-led administration calls back ideas of it brings back, ideas of Iraq, 2003, the occupation. So he needs to abandon these ideas in order for a break to actually bear fruit. And this, I think, is where everybody is kind of scratching their heads because Donald Trump is so erratic and so unpredictable. It's hard to get inside his head.
John, what about his trip to the Gulf region? Weren't the Gaza mentioned? I mean, when he was in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, I didn't see any reports about anybody talking about Gaza. Maybe a little bit different with Qatar, and for really surprising that the White House and the Trump administration had direct negotiations with Hamas, which is something that maybe Israel didn't know or knew about it. And Hamas gave the U.S. That moment that Trump was looking for, which is releasing the American-Israeli hostage. And nothing happened. So was his trip to the Middle East void of Gaza, or you think there is something was negotiated and maybe we haven't seen the results of it yet?
So first, on the hostage release itself, it is quite remarkable that the United States negotiated directly with Hamas to release the last Israeli American hostage, and this should be commended. All the hostages should be released, and the war should end. When he went to the Middle East, there's really two things I would look at. One is this, his main incentive for going to the Middle East, to the Gulf Arab states, were economic deals. I mean, he signed all of these, huge $1.4 trillion deal with the Emirates, all these deals with these different states, a lot of money that these states actually don't have, but that's a different topic. But on the matter of Gaza, it didn't feature prominently publicly. And I think that shows, one, that the Gulf Arab states are ultimately interested, have their own self-interests. Two, what I've heard is that there was considerable talk behind the scenes about Gaza and Iran, with the Gulf Arab states saying, hey, we do not want war with Tehran. We're focused on economic development and so on. And two, they did push the Gaza issue privately, saying, this needs to come to an end, especially if Trump wants to see the expansion of his Abraham Accords, which are problematic for a host of reasons. But so I think this was pushed pretty strongly to him, especially about the images coming out of Gaza and the just horrific humanitarian disaster that's taking place. But something else I would note about his trip to the Middle East is the speech that he gave in Saudi Arabia, whereby he really bashed U.S. interventionism in the region, attempts at nation building, and so on. So that was somewhat, a break from what we've seen in the past, and that was pretty significant rhetoric. But just like the rhetoric of the rift, just like the rhetoric of frustration between Biden and Netanyahu, talk is cheap. We need to see this reflected in policy.
Hey, we're speaking to John Hoffman. He is a writer, and he wrote an article. Um, the Trump Netanyahu rift hinges on Gaza and Iran, with the subheadline, for the administration to achieve its goals in the Middle East, more daylight between the U.S. and Israel is necessary. Well, how much daylight is there? Because it seems like the Trump administration is not, there's kind of a division there. There are like two camps. There are those that are really America first and they want to be isolationists, but then you've got all these, you know, kind of neocon types, Marco Rubio, just, I don't know, Hexes, others that are very much pro-Israel. And sometimes people may even go as far as saying, they act as if it's Israel first. People like Michael Waltz. And, that's a whole different story. I feel like the media here is not fully forthcoming about Michael Waltz's role and how he was actually trying to undermine Trump by aiding and assisting Netanyahu how to manipulate Trump and go into war with Iran. A lot of people think that he was actually fired because of the signal chat group over Yemen. But in reality, he was fired because of a different signal chat group, which he had specifically with Netanyahu using an app that's designed by the Israelis, which to me seems like kind of treason to work with a different state to undermine your own president. That's a different story. How much of this administration that Trump has is actually very much working for, I guess, the agenda of Israel?
So there's a few things here. One, I would say if this rift between Trump and Netanyahu really does materialize more, I would say this is a rift between individuals. We're not seeing a rift in the U.S.-Israel relationship, which I've argued for a long time. The problems of this are structural in nature. They extend beyond any one individual leader. It's really the dysfunctions surrounding this quote unquote special relationship. But what we're seeing with Trump is more of this break at the individual level between him and Netanyahu, him viewing Netanyahu as an impediment to his own agenda and so on and so forth. But there are two competing camps within the administration, and we see this reflected in the media about this more hawkish neocon wing, like you just mentioned, and then a more, I wouldn't call them restraint, but I would say, more skeptical of U.S. Military interventions abroad and so on. So we're seeing this fight out, and I think two things. One, the Mike Waltz thing reflects it pretty strongly that there are those in Washington, D.C., who are, careered people in Washington, D.C., and there's decades of policy inertia pushing the United States towards very pro-Israel directions or pushing the United States towards war with Iran in particular. And we saw that, with the Mike Waltz fiasco. But really what is happening, I would say, is a break also within the Republican Party at the popular level, because we see a lot of polling coming out over the past several weeks of views of Israel within the United States, views of military action against Iran within the United States. And not only are a majority of Americans starting to have less positive views of Israel and are still against a war with Iran, the real driver of this is the change within the Republican Party, especially among that 18 to 35 age group.
What about just conservative think tanks and just the foreign policy establishment in Washington? Are they, growing tired of this what Israel's doing and continue to drag the United States into these wars, trying to manipulate, to get the U.S. to fight their battles for them, just like They dragged him into fighting Iraq. I mean, a lot of times people say, well, no, Israel had nothing to do with it. Netanyahu's on the record coming and giving testimony in Congress, talking about weapons of mass destruction and how the U.S. should, go after Iraq. Now he's trying to get them to bomb Iran. Um, bombing Syria, Lebanon. It's like there's no country around Israel that Israel's not interested in bombing. And then at the end, they end up just saying, well, we're under threat by everybody around us. So are people in Washington, especially on the conservative side, are they kind of growing tired of what Israel's doing, and seeing that, maybe what Israel's doing is not in the best interest of the United States?
Sure. Well, first on the Iraq part, I actually had to pull the quote for a different article that I'm working on, and I'd like to read it verbatim for your listeners. This is Netanyahu speaking to Congress in 2002. He said, "If you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee you that it will have enormous positive reverberations on the region." That didn't age too well. But so, and we're seeing a similar push for war with Iran, and Netanyahu is actually on record pushing for war with Iran, specifically with the United States in the lead since 1996. So this push is very real. It's been going on for decades. And whether the foreign policy establishment in Washington, D.C., the so-called blob, if you will, whether they're changing, I would say probably not. A lot of these places kind of depend on this idea of American primacy, on U.S. military engagement abroad, just about everywhere. So for their own livelihoods, I think they do not want to see this, quote unquote, daylight. But I think at the popular level in the United States, among the American people, I think you're really seeing a change. And this is just a personal, funny line, but I grew up in very rural Virginia. And when Trump announced the deal with the Houthis, I remember a family member of mine called me and they said, "Did you see the deal with the Houthis?" And I said, "How do you know what the Houthis are? You live on a farm." But it really goes to show just how this conflict has really consumed the American public at the popular level, and we're seeing a lot of frustration with U.S. policy.
You probably heard about the Houthis because Trump was announced it, and then he's talking about their bravery and kind of praising them, which really pissed off, upset the Israelis, because Trump has this kind of habit of he doesn't know when to stop talking. And the
Yeah,
same
no,
thing
he,
about
he
the
he goes off script, and whether it was the Houthis, calling them strong and brave, or talking about Jarrah in Syria, calling him very handsome. I mean, it's
yeah,
classic.
the president of Syria, who was, the establishment in DC thinks he's, basically a former terrorist with Al Qaeda, and now he's calling him handsome, so that a lot of Syrians actually that I know are like, wow, he's calling the president handsome, so they they kind of like that. But yeah, he goes off script and says things kind of like, yeah, off the cuff that you don't expect. And some of his followers, I guess, like that kind of stuff, very unorthodox and kind of shaking things up there. But it seems I still, it's like Trump says one thing, and then somehow Rubio, who tries to put in his policy, is doing one thing, and then Steve Witkoff, who's the envoy for the Middle East or does the negotiations, he's kind of doing his own thing. So, I mean, from your assessment, how is this all coming together, these different camps and kind of competing agendas and ideologies? I mean, I truly think that somebody like Rubio is just ideologically Zionist, even though he's not necessarily Jewish himself, but he's more Zionist than most Jews that I know. But how are these things kind of squaring off within the Trump administration? Or does Trump appreciate these kind of different figures kind of going at it and having competing views, and he's kind of the decision maker at the end?
Yeah, I think this administration is unique because there's an old adage in Washington, D.C., that personnel is policy. Typically, you could tell the policies that a president would pursue by the people that he surrounds himself with. I don't think that's necessarily the case here with Trump. Uh, really all decisions are being made by one individual, and Trump really chose his team based on loyalty more than anything else. Uh,
Mm-mm.
so it's difficult to judge the extent to which these different actors actually have agency. And I would say ultimately the buck stops with Trump. He will be the one who, if he ends or if he pressures Israel towards ending the war in Gaza, that the pressure would come from him. And if he seals a deal with Iran, it's ultimately going to be one that he approves. And about this going off script, this is what makes it so difficult to gauge his policies and where his thinking is, because you never know what Truth Social post is actual policy or him just popping off one day. Um, and then even there are members on his team. So this past weekend, Steve Witkoff said that any form of enrichment, even 1% by Iran, is a quote unquote red line for the United States. Well, if that is indeed a red line for the United States, that is a non-starter for Tehran. So that means negotiations will fail. So it's so difficult to gauge what is actual actionable rhetoric that's going to translate into policy and what is either a rhetoric meant to try and shape negotiations, or B, just either rhetoric from somebody who is not calling the shots, or rhetoric that ultimately won't influence the policies that Trump wants to pursue.
Yeah, like the stock market's very volatile. Any day something new can be said or that changes so much. And I mean, it's my opinion, but I just think that, Trump, uh, you know, uh, is really pursuing. He thinks he deserves to get the Nobel Peace Prize for whatever reason. And I feel like a lot of the stuff that he's doing is in pursuit of that. Like that's a goal of his. So
Big
wherever there's
time.
hostility, like I don't know, Rwanda, he wants to jump in. Pakistan, and India wants to, make a deal. He wants, he really wants to make this deal in Gaza and just throwing things out there with Iran. So I think that, he's probably jealous that we're upset that Obama
Obama.
got the Nobel Peace Prize and he hasn't.
But
So that's
Ahmed,
just, yeah.
Ahmed and John, but he doesn't follow through. I mean, he was talking about Ukraine and as if there is nothing happening on the face of earth except Ukraine. Then he moves to Gaza. Then he moves to South Africa. So I don't see him following through, commenting on what you're saying, Ahmed
Well, I
and
mean,
John.
he's saying it. It's whatever is trending, right? I mean, he said something about Ukraine. I think you're pronouncing Ukraine in the Arabic way, Ukraine,
Oh,
which I
oh
guess
yeah.
I think that's how Ukrainians also say it, by the way, and Russians. You're saying Ukraine. So for our listeners, that's some are talking about Ukraine. Well, yeah, I mean, he's talking about what's trending, and then he's also just the media, the amount of media he does, like every day. Like he talks more than White House spokesperson. Every day he's giving interviews. Every day it's just like hours long. He's just constantly putting out so much content. I think he's just trying to drown out everyone else with his content. But like Summer said, is this rhetoric translating into policy, or because some people described him before, especially in the first term, he wasn't really interested in policy. He was more interested in the other stuff and kind of like the prestige. But how much of this is actually translating into policy?
So that's where it's difficult, but we have a couple examples. And one is the direct negotiations with Hamas. I mean, that is something that Netanyahu and his advisor, Ron Dermer, tried to sabotage back in March. If you remember when Adam Boehler, the hostage envoy, mentioned on TV that the United States was engaged directly with Hamas, immediately report from Times of Israel that I cite in the piece here for American Conservative, they were working to undermine this. So that's significant in and of itself. The Houthi stuff is again significant. One, because the deal that was sealed with the Houthis did not include anything about them targeting Israel or Israeli ships. We've seen them continue to target Israel since the agreement was made, and the United States has not taken military action. And then another was Syria. uh, I think it was December of last year that Reuters did an exclusive article, and they said that Israel was lobbying the United States to keep Syria weak, to keep pressure on Syria. And
Hmm.
instead, what we've seen is one, Trump announced that he's going to remove the sanctions. Two, that the United States is going to start withdrawing some troops. Again, this is also despite Israel's objections. They wanted the U.S. troops to stay. Uh, and three, I mean, you could say, I guess maybe calling them handsome is might be um, uh, I'm sure that didn't make the Israelis too happy. But then also with Iran too, we haven't seen a deal yet. But if you remember, Netanyahu was informed that the United States was going to pursue negotiations with Iran while he was here in DC to push the United States to strike Iran. And it was during that press conference that Trump said, no, we're actually going to engage directly in negotiations. And that surprised Netanyahu because that whole trip, the media kind of portrayed it as, oh, he's going to come talk about tariffs. But what it was really about was he wanted support for military action against Tehran. And we know now that Trump told him, one, no, you will not strike Iran while negotiations are going on. And two, we've seen Netanyahu kind of boxed in by this on Iran. It's very doubtful that he could launch a military strike against Iran against Trump's wishes, and Trump, because it's Donald Trump and who he is with his personality, would not just go crazy and be furious. So I think Trump has a real opportunity here if he seizes it, but it's a matter of will he seize it?
I want to remind our listeners that True Talk will be raising funds next week for WMNFs, and without your support, we won't be having such smart, intelligent people like John Hoffman. Dr. John Hoffman is the author of the latest published article, The Trump Netanyahu Rift Hinges on Europe. On Gaza and Iran. I want to ask you, John, you mentioned in your interesting piece that there is no strategic justification for the US to keep bankrolling the war in Gaza. And I want to allude to what is happening in Europe, which is a little bit surprising because we know that Israel is originally a European colonial project, and we are seeing the British, the French, the Spanish governments are taking stands and very, very different language. I have not seen it in all my life, really following the Arab-Israeli conflict. So is there something happening in Europe that is not happening in the US? Or how can you explain this maybe rift between the US and Europe when it comes to Israel? And were you surprised from these latest developments in Europe?
I was surprised, first and foremost, because I think, like you said, this is rhetoric that I don't think I've ever seen before. And I think it's because it's gotten to a point in the war where even ardent supporters of Israel's war are saying, what is the benefit of continuing this conflict? And instead of we've seen over the past 19 months a disconnect between the stated ends of Israel and the means that it's using. The total elimination of Hamas politically and militarily is just not possible. The return of the hostages, only 8 hostages were freed via military force. More than 130 were freed pursuant to negotiations with Hamas. And what we're seeing now is even in the rhetoric of Netanyahu and others, they said, no, our goal is fully seizing Gaza, fully controlling it after the war. Bezalel Smotrich the other day, I mean, he said on TV, he said, we are now, what did he say? He said, we're cleansing and occupying and staying, essentially, is what he said. And Netanyahu yesterday just said that a new condition for ending the war is the implementation of Trump's Riviera plan. So I think people are starting to see the writing on the wall here and seeing this for what it is. I should also note, I've spoken with members of the Israeli security establishment and so on. There's also a recognition among the Israeli security and intelligence establishment that there is no strategic benefit for them continuing the war. They note that the two goals of the war, the total elimination of Hamas and the freeing of the hostages, are mutually incompatible, and they see this as what's going on. And Witkoff even reportedly said this to the hostage families. They said this war is only continuing because one individual is trying to prolong it for his political purposes. Well, not one individual, but Netanyahu's at the forefront of it here. Him and his coalition. People are seeing that this is being continued for political purposes, and the ramifications are just these apocalyptic videos and pictures coming out of Gaza that we see on a daily basis.
You mentioned something a while ago, John. You said the Abrahamic Accords are problematic. What did you mean by that? And is there any role behind the scenes for Jared Kushner during the Trump's administration your first administration? Jared Kushner read a few books and then became an expert on the Middle East, and he's supposedly the one who came up with the genius idea of Abrahamic Accord. So does he have any role behind the scenes, or he's completely out of the picture? And what is it problematic about the Abrahamic Accords?
Sure. Yeah. No. I think what was it? He said he read 20 or 25 books. I mean, that makes you an expert right there. But there's actually been several public reports that Kushner is advising Trump and advising others in the administration on Israel Gaza, but also on the Abraham Accords and Middle East policy writ large. So I think that's been publicly acknowledged, that Kushner is playing some role here. Regarding the Abraham Accords, I think there's a number of issues here. One, if we really look at the three main actors involved in the Abraham Accords, the United States, Israel, and then the Arab states, just view them as a bloc. If we break down what their interests were really in sealing this, is this really had nothing to do with peace. This had everything to do with power. And for Israel, the main objectives of the Abraham Accords were twofold. It was one, to completely sideline the Palestinian issue, to completely take it off the table. They were going to push for this high-level rapprochement with Arab dictators that just completely excludes the Palestinian people. The second for Israel was the creation of a coalition to balance against Iran, who they view as their chief arch nemesis. For the Arab states, this was one, a way to cozy up to Washington, D.C. By cozying up to Israel. And two, this was a way to keep the money and the patronage flowing from the United States as these autocracies deepen their repressive policies at home. For the United States, the real guiding idea behind the Abraham Accords was this idea that the United States is going to create a more formal coalition through which it could advance its interest in the Middle East as it pivots elsewhere, towards the Indo-Pacific, towards China, and so on. But I've argued, till I'm blue in the face, that this is not a coalition for the United States to pivot out of the Middle East. In fact, the actors in the Abraham Accords, they would never agree to such a coalition if they thought it would come with the United States abdicating from the region, because they want the United States there as their security guarantor. So this was a way for them to keep the United States deeply engaged in the region. And we've seen a number of initiatives build off of the Abraham Accords that are designed to do exactly that, which is keep the United States deeply politically and militarily engaged in the region.
I want to ask you, John, if the White House calls you and says, I want you to come tomorrow and give the president a few steps, how can he end the war in Gaza?
Sure. So first, I don't think I'll ever get that call, but if I did, I think the number one thing that I would say is Trump, like any president, just like Biden had, they have leverage. And it is the massive amounts of military aid, arms sales, and diplomatic cover that the United States provides to Israel. Israel has been burning through its munitions. It is so heavily reliant on the United States. The bombs that we're seeing in Gaza all say made in the United States on them. There was actually a 60 Minutes episode. I think it was from January. They did an expose on the shrapnel and so on, the weapon debris that they were finding in Gaza, and they were showing that it just says blatantly made in the United States on there. So they need the United States to continue bankrolling this effort. And it is as simple as a phone call from Donald Trump saying it's done. That, I think, would be the ultimate signal that this war is over. And if Trump went public with it and said we're done bankrolling this, there needs to be peace. Look at the images coming out. It's not good for, obviously, for the Palestinian people. It's not good for the United States, and arguably it's not good for Israel either, because of the damage that it's doing to Israel's international image. I mean, I think the letter that you mentioned from the European states is remarkable in that sense. I would have never guessed that you would have seen something like that. But the anger and the frustration that you've seen towards Israel over this conflict is profound, and I think it's going to have lasting ramifications on Israel.
So we're coming close to the end of the show. What's for our listeners that are not fully aware, what's the current status in Gaza through how much has the U.S. spent since October 2023 on this war?
So
And,
that's difficult.
how much of that? Yeah.
Yeah, that's difficult. There's a really good report. If anybody's interested, it's by the Cost of War Project at Brown University. It's by William Hartung and a couple others. I forget the names. But they did a deep dive trying to figure out how much the United States has spent on the war in Gaza. First, there's the publicly disclosed 17 and change billion that the United States has just given in military aid to Israel. But this doesn't even begin to account for the massive military buildups in the Middle East that the United States has undergone since October 7th. The Houthis alone, there was a great piece in New York Times the other day saying that it's an estimated 7 billion the United States spent just on the Houthi campaign alone, which was just the most unnecessary and counterproductive and strategically imprudent campaign that we've seen. Even Biden, nothing wraps it up better than Biden's words. Is it working? No. Is it going to continue? Yes. That sums up Middle East policy pretty well. But and then of course there's been tens of billions of dollars in weaponry and so on. So it's hard to even tally this number. Also because a lot of these arms sales have been bypassed Congress. There was also a good article by, I think it was John Hudson at the Washington Post about how a lot of these weapons have been kind of secretly passed under the table to Israel. And it's difficult to even be able to begin to assess the extent of this. I don't think we'll know for quite some time.
Now, since the Trump administration came into power, there's been a couple of incidences where through executive orders or through Marco Rubio's State Department that they were able to just send weapons to Israel without necessarily Congress's approval or like bypassing Congress. How much was that and what was that for?
So this is unfortunately a rather commonplace action that takes place in D.C. is this declaration of an emergency to push through weapon sales. We've seen most administrations do this. I remember Trump did it during his first term to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but they've also done it to Israel. If I remember the report correctly, I think it was an $8 billion arms package that was carried over from the Biden administration. And then I believe, don't quote me on this exact number, but I believe the Trump administration then pushed through its own $5 billion deal. So that in and of itself is 13 billion right there.
And what's the death toll now in Gaza, and how many people have been injured?
So that is what we see from Gaza health authorities is I think it in the ballpark of 53,000, but I don't think anybody knows what the actual death toll is in Gaza. There is the Lancet has been doing a lot of great reporting on this, saying that this number is almost impossible to determine because the level of destruction with across Gaza makes trying to find accurate numbers impossible. I've seen their estimates range in the hundred something thousand. So it's almost impossible to tell until this fighting actually stops.
And as far as I mean, as far as we can from reading and stuff, it seems like Israel has basically decimated the place. They're going area by area and just flattening it, turning it into rubble. Neighborhood by neighborhood, city by city. Gaza is a very small area, and it just seems that they're trying to congregate the Palestinians into very small areas within Gaza that they can somehow control. um, I mean, is it your understanding that they're trying to change the realities on the ground so they can say, well, hey, there's no place for these people to live here. They can't stay. It's for their own safety. They got to leave. At the end, really just getting them off the land.
Yeah, so I think between 70 and 80% of Gaza is either occupied by the Israeli military or is a demilitarized zone, so saying that people need to leave. So that's pushing the 2 million Palestinians that reside in Gaza into an area that is only 20 to 30% the size of Gaza. And as, like you said, Gaza was already incredibly densely packed before the war. On whether the Israeli government is leveling everything on purpose to make it uninhabitable. One, we know it's uninhabitable because Trump and Witkoff and everybody has says it's uninhabitable. Two, as I cited in the American Conservative article here, Netanyahu himself privately acknowledged to Knesset members that his objective is to destroy the remaining remnants of infrastructure in Gaza in hopes of driving out its inhabitants. So he's said it, So it's kind of clear as day.
Yeah, and uh, but what do you make of? Do you think that there's any pressure on the United States? And I think you kind of touched this during his tour to the Middle East. But is there more growing pressure on the United States from allies or in the Middle East that this could spin out of control? 'Cause, I've read things like in Egypt, they're worried that this may actually lead to the toppling of Sisi, because the more this drags on, the more anger that there is in the Middle East, and that creates for a very unstable situation.
Yeah, and there is a lot of anger in the Middle East. It's not reported on much anymore. It was somewhat earlier, actually, but I haven't seen a lot of reporting on it recently, which is unfortunate. But thousands of people have been arrested across the Middle East by these regimes over their protesting of what's happening in Gaza. And they're being arrested because the Palestinian issue is something in the Middle East that unites the Arab people across the ideological spectrum, far left, far right, in the middle. Everybody wants Palestinian liberation. And the Arab regimes, the dictatorships in the region fear this because of its mobilizing potential. And we saw some reports on this last year, but we haven't seen anything recently, which I hope more coverage is given to this issue. But no, I think one, if you think about Trump's plan, this we're going to relocate them in Egypt or Jordan, that would collapse the governments of Egypt and Jordan. One, they don't have the economic capabilities to take these people in. Their economies are horrible as is. Two, their people would go absolutely crazy if if these governments went along with the ethnic cleansing plan and were like, yeah, they're here now. So I think Trump is hearing this from the region states, and I think he's hearing it also from the Gulf Arab states, who
Yeah.
are highly autocratic and so on. but at the current moment are focused on economic development. They're trying to restructure kind of the basis of authoritarian rule in places like Saudi Arabia. And conflict is not a good way to attract investment and so on, which they desperately
Yeah.
need to
So,
kind of
John,
change.
we're gonna actually have to leave it there because we're out of time. But thank you so much. Thank you guys for joining us. This has been WMNF Tampa on True Talk. The scoop is next. Have a great weekend, everyone. And John, thanks again for joining us. Hope to have you back on at
No, of
some
course.
point
Thank
in
you
the near
both so
future.
much.
Yeah. Samar, take care. Have a